much time you need? Got your recorder going?
Yep. Yes, we do.
It goes automatically to YouTube, does it?
Yes, it does.
Okay, good.
It's private, so we're the only ones who can view this unless it's made public.
Okay, I'm going to be drinking coffee, if you don't mind.
That is totally fine.
Okay, it's what I call the socially acceptable drug from Colombia. Okay, you got a whole bunch of questions?
Yes,
we do.
And we, like you said in your email, we read and listened to a lot of your podcasts and read your articles. So we do understand your views on the topic.
Okay.
But just for the sake of our project in the video, we're going to ask some questions that may seem a little bit obvious, but just so that
you need it on the record. Yeah, you need it on the official record. No problem. Yeah. By the way, I tongue in cheek, I could say that by talking to me, you're possibly putting yourself in danger because Al Gore and the state's attorney generals are planning to take people like me to court for, for being deniers. There's a whole lawsuit. I've had several lawsuits, and it's kind of frightening what's going on. Suppression of free speech. But and we're being charged, by the way, under what's called the RICO law, which is the racketeering law, which was set up to deal with mafia. And now they're talking about dealing with climate deniers in the same way. So it's kind of an interesting side to what we're doing here. And it really is very fundamental to free speech. But anyway, that puts kind of a heavy tone on all we're going to do here. And I just wanted to let you know what's going on.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And if we are called to court, we are on your side.
We are on your side 100%.
Well, thank you. I mean, even if you're not, just the concept of free speech should be defended, right?
Most definitely.
Yeah. It's like Voltaire said, I disagree with you completely, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, that's another whole political and philosophical letter. Okay, go with your questions.
All right. So I just wanted to start with just like the overall question of where you stand on the issue
of the issue of climate change.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Okay. Getting a bit of breakup here, but that's fine. The answer to the question is that climate change has always occurred, is occurring, and will always occur in the future, and that what's going on with current climate change is well within natural climate variability. The issue really came up when it was called global warming. And of course, they switched from calling it global warming to saying it's climate change around the year 2000, when the evidence wasn't fitting their narrative. Because what was happening was the temperatures were leveling off and CO2 kept increasing. So instead of going back and looking at their science, they moved the goalposts is what they did, okay? And so when it started out as global warming, I was not opposed to the argument that the world was warming up. What I was opposed to was that humans were the cause of that. And that's a very important distinction to make, because when I started studying climate back in the 1970s, late 60s and 70s, global cooling was the consensus. That the CIA were writing reports about the world's going to freeze and an ice age is coming and everything else. And I was as opposed to that as I am now to the warming, because the temperature trends up and down all of the time. And so it's not that I don't believe in global warming or that I don't believe in climate change. It's just what is the cause of the change in climate. And the claim that humans are almost totally to blame for it is absolute nonsense and scientific nonsense. And worse than that, it's science that's been deliberately created for a political agenda. So that's where I'm in on it. And of course, one of the reasons I'm such a threat and why I've had all the lawsuits is, A, they couldn't say I wasn't qualified. And that's an interesting thing to look at, is they have Al Gore on. They never ask him how he's qualified, but immediately I'm on a radio or TV program. Well, what are your qualifications? So they couldn't say I wasn't qualified. And the bigger problem was that I was given a natural ability to explain things in ways people can understand them. And of course, that then made me a real threat, because much as I love the guy Richard Lindzen from MIT, yeah, he agrees with me, but when you listen to him to explain it, you're just shaking your head. Well, you know, he's one of those clever professors, but impossible to understand what he's saying. And so yeah. I was a threat. And by the way, that ability is sort of a side note here, but I love the classroom. I was one of the rare professors that loved teaching. I love being in the classroom. It's one of the things that I really miss, although I do a lot of school visits. But it meant that I ended up teaching a science credit that was a required course for art students. So the idea was that art students would learn how science works, what the scientific method is. And so that came about because of my ability to explain complex things in relatively simple ways. That's kind of a bit outside of your question, but it relates to why I'm such a threat to this false agenda that they've created about humans causing global warming and now climate change.
Okay, so my question is based off of one of the articles that I read from your website, and it is, why do so many globally recognized scientists want for us to believe that global warming is our fault? Do you think that because the poles are areas that we don't know very much about, it's easier for them to feed us these ideas that global warming is caused from CO2 emissions of humans?
Yeah, and that's a question I get asked all the time, is how come, you know, you're saying this and the majority of scientists don't agree with you? And one of the things that they did to emphasize that was they came out, and you've seen the numbers, 97% of scientists agree. Well, it turned out that research done by the University of Queensland was completely false. In fact, when you looked at their data, it was less than 3% that were actually agreeing. And the question about, well, how come there are thousands of scientists that don't agree with me or accept the official line? There's two answers for that. One is a lot of them, of course, the amount of research funding involved. And I hate to say it, but in today's academic world, your career is determined not just by the quality of your research, but how much money you bring to the university. And this came about a few years ago, and I watched the change, because you might have heard the phrase, it used to be publish or perish. What that meant was if you weren't publishing articles as an academic, you weren't going to get promoted and you weren't going to get research funding. Now it's become bring in research funding or perish. And of course, the reason that started was as governments cut funding to universities were looking for new sources of income. And they realized that if a professor was getting, say, $10 million of research funds, they could take 35% of that and say, look, we're providing you with an office and heat and light and so on. And so funding became a very important part of what was going on. The third point is that the vast majority of scientists never even look at the climate science. Just to give you there are probably, well, I know in certain disciplines, you will have, say, 500 professional journals published just in chemistry every year. You can't possibly keep up with what's going on in all the other disciplines. So most scientists never even look. They just assume that what the government is telling them through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's other scientists. They say, well, they wouldn't lie to us. We accept what they're telling us. And so what happens is, and I've got on my website, you'll see the quote from Professor Klaus Eckhart Puls, a German meteorologist and physicist, you know, where he says, look, when I went and looked at what they were saying, I couldn't believe it. And this is what's happening. So this is why all of those factors come together and they can isolate people like me. And of course, the other thing they do, and your generation is very familiar with this, with the internet, the conspiracy theorists. just everywhere, who killed Kennedy, and on and on and on. And one of the ways that you marginalize people, and you see this going on in your school, if you want to isolate a person, you simply push them out of the crowd, and then they say, well, they don't fit. There's something wrong with them. And I'll give you an example with President Obama. If anybody dared to even ask questions about his qualifications, he's a birther. Well, if you're a birther, that means, you're some kind of weird conspiracy theorist. So you marginalize people by doing that. With me, it happened where I was a global warming skeptic. All right. And so it marginalized. Then when they changed from global warming to climate change, I became a climate change denier with all of the Holocaust, Jewish Holocaust connotations of the word denier. So it was very easy to marginalize. But what you see is when you show other scientists what has actually gone on scientifically, they realize and recognize right away what's happening. And of course, more and more of that is happening all the time. It's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but it needs the context. Anyway, go ahead with your next question.
I just wanted to say really quick in regards to the data that shows that 97% of scientists agree with climate change. I saw one of the videos that you were in where you showed the Vostok ice cores, how there was actually the 800-year lag.
Yeah.
And I went and I asked my science teacher about it and why it's taught the way that it is if there's data against it. And he said, because the majority of scientists agree with this, he actually said because only 3% are opposed to it.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of
well, of course, the initial response is consensus is only applicable in politics. It doesn't apply to science. Like Einstein said, I can have 100 facts prove I'm right. You get one fact, prove me wrong. That's the end of it. And so the argument that, not all the scientists agree, if you look at the history of science, it's always been the few that question and challenge what is indoctrinated in the schools. And of course, the other part, by the way, with that, before the 97% figure, there was a 95% figure of agreement that was used by Al Gore in his movie, The Inconvenient Truth. And that was a woman by the name of Naomi Oreskes. And what she did was she put into the computer Google search global warming, got 900 and some articles back, and she said every single one of them agreed that global warming due to humans was occurring. Well, as you know, when you do a Google search, the results are determined by the keywords that you use, right? You change the keywords and you get different results. And so when somebody said, no, human-induced global warming, they got a completely different result. And so there was a 95% figure that Gore used in his movie. That came before the 97% figure. And of course, the 97% figure was brought out because we showed what was wrong with the 95% figure. So then they did this survey and cooked the books on it. And if you're interested, I can give you the references to well, it's on my website too, about the breakdown of the 97% figure. Next question.
Okay, so I was, so since you're talking about Al Gore and like kind of going into detail, why do you think he got all of his data so like mixed up, kind of like his data is like what he got is so different from what you think, and then he published a movie on. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first comment is that it's not just me that has that opinion about Gore and his movie. It's political propaganda, and it's very good. It's very good political propaganda, but it's political propaganda nonetheless. And it's not just me that said that, because the week before he got the Nobel Prize for the movie Inconvenient Truth, a father in England got tired of his son having to watch Gore's movie 4 times and saying, no, there's another side to the story that's not being presented in the schools. So he took the Department of Education and Gore's movie to court. and said, look, this Gore's got major scientific errors in the movie, and it's political propaganda. The judge agreed with that. The judge ruled that Gore's movie was political propaganda and that there were at least 9 major scientific errors. Now, the judge did the right thing, and this is an important lesson for you guys, because the judge said, I'm not saying don't show the movie. What I'm saying is, if you're going to show the movie, warn the students that it's political propaganda, tell them what the major scientific errors are, but also show another movie that presents the other side of the story. And I was very flattered, because the documentary that the judge recommended was the Great Global Warming Swindle, which is one that I happen to be part of. And so the judge did the right thing in terms of education, and is what I've always argued. Don't tell people what to think. Give them both sides of the argument. Let them make up their own mind. And so what's happening in today's world is education is becoming indoctrination, not education. And unfortunately, you'll find that's true even when you go to university. In fact, it's probably worse in the university. The prof tells you what to think. You tell the prof what he said, and he gives you an A, and everybody's happy. It hasn't advanced your knowledge or understanding one bit, but that's what's happening in today's world. So that's the situation with regard to Gore's movie, and it's also, of course, the fact that Gore had the power and the money to have the documentary made in Hollywood. And it was produced by a Hollywood producer, and as I said, it was a superb piece of political propaganda. And also, of course, he also arranged for him and the IPCC people to get the Nobel Prize in Peace Prize for what they did, which is absolute nonsense. Sorry, did that answer your question adequately?
Yeah, I did. So I have another part to it. You kind of touched on it. So
okay.
You think that his movie should still be shown, like people should still have the option of watching his movie even though there is incorrect data in it?
Yes, and this is, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is part of the argument about free speech. You either have free speech or you don't. You can't start saying, well, you can say this and you can't say that, because who makes those decisions? And so I've been attacked, and very nasty things have been said about me, death threats and everything else. Well, that's the price you pay if you speak out in public. And I accept that. But the minute I say things in Canada, I get lawsuits, defaming me. And so the whole idea about what should be taught in the schools, what should be said, and I'll give you an example. When I talk to the public, quite often I'll start out by saying morning. And I'll say, did you notice I didn't say good morning? Make up your own mind. Who am I to tell you what to think? But of course, that's what's going on in society. Everybody wants to tell you what to think and how to think. So, yeah, I no question that the documentary should be shown. But as the judge said, if you're going to use it in the schools, then advise, the teacher has the obligation to tell the students, look, this is political propaganda and there are these major errors in it. But you still show it, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So your main belief, it seems, is that like CO2 is not the cause for temperature change. But what do you believe?
That's a good question. The nice, simple questions that are really good. And I got to tell you a joke, by the way. I was talking to a grade 4 class, and they were studying about the fur trade in history, and they wanted to. I was talking about the weather during the fur trade era, and the teacher introduced me as a climatologist, and the little guy put his hand up, and I said, "You got a question?" He said, "Yeah. How many mountains have you climbed anyway?" Right. What else would a climatologist do? But the answer to your question is the sun. One of the things, and this is going to surprise you a little bit, and it's a bit well, I'll frame it in a way that we talked about earlier about conspiracy theories. And one of the things that all of the conspiracy theories on the internet, and the one you hear about most is who shot John Kennedy. I already mentioned that, and Coast to Coast, George Noory at night, and he's always on about it. And I, like of a lot of people, think, oh, commission of inquiry, wonderful. You're going to get the politics out of the issue. And the politician says, okay, I'll appoint a commission of inquiry. They're talking about it now with Hillary Clinton and all the rest of it. And everybody says, oh, great, we'll get the politics out of it. I learned the very first commission of inquiry I was appointed to that, in fact, it gives the politicians greater control. And let me explain why, and I'll get it back to your question about the CO2 and the sun. But the first commission I was appointed to was argument about water in a lake levels and who owned the water and everything else. A lot of controversy. The politicians didn't want to do anything about it. So he finally came out and the minister said, okay, we're going to have a commission of inquiry. And everybody's, hey, great, Then the minister goes back, and with the bureaucrats, they sent the commissioners, including me, what are called terms of reference. Okay? In other words, they say, this is what you've got to look at. And I looked at the terms of reference and I said to the chairman of the commission, we can't even get the data we need to solve the problem. That's how much the minister's trying to limit and predetermine the outcome of the commission. And so the chairman said, what do you want to do? I said, go to the minister and tell him that unless we get full access to everything, I'm going to go to the media and say the minister is trying to predetermine the outcome. So the terms of reference that a commissioner given are how the politicians control the commission of inquiry. Let's put that back onto the Kennedy assassination. Justice Warren of the Supreme Court of the U.S. was appointed to look into the Kennedy assassination. I was watching him on ABC before he passed away, and they said to him, well, why didn't you look at the mafia connection with Jack Ruby in Dallas and who killed Lee Harvey Oswald and so on? And the judge simply said, it wasn't in my terms of reference. And I'm sitting there saying, aha. I knew what he was saying. Most people didn't have any idea. What he was saying was, I was told not to go there. Now, what is the biggest conspiracy discussion on the internet other than the Kennedy assassination and the mafia connection in Dallas and all the rest of it? Now, that's exactly what happened when they determined that they wanted to show that humans were causing global warming. So they set up a commission of inquiry called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which you're all familiar with. They then wrote them a definition of climate change. And the definition of climate change that they were given in 1992 said, you only look at human causes of climate change, which means don't look at the sun, don't look at the oceans, don't look at any of that stuff, just look at CO2 and methane, those greenhouse gases. That's how they narrowed the focus of the research down. And of course, the problem is, unless you know how much the climate is changing naturally, you can't possibly identify the portion that humans might be causing. And so that was why my opening argument or comment to you was, yeah, climate change is occurring. What's occurring is well within natural variability. What I'm opposed to is whether there's any evidence that humans and human CO2 is causing any change. Now, the other thing was that the real issue is not climate change or global warming. The real issue is overpopulation. Okay, and I think you probably read about this. And the Club of Rome, you come across that? Okay, and sorry, this is a long-winded answer to your question about if it isn't CO2, what is it? I haven't forgotten that. And I used to love that when students would ask questions to try and divert me away from my lecture. I love those games. Not that you guys would do a thing like that. But anyway, it starts with a guy by the name of Malthus, Thomas Malthus. And Malthus wrote a book saying that the world population would outgrow the food supply. His work was the total influence on Darwin's theory of evolution. In fact, Darwin took Malthus's book with him on his trip to the Galapagos. And so the Club of Rome, which was formed in 1968, said, hey, the population isn't just outgrowing the food supply, it's exhausting all of the resources. It's using up all the resources. So that's where you got terms like peak oil, okay, that we're going to run out of oil. And there was a basic study done, published in a book called Limits to Growth. What that meant was that the world population would grow so rapidly, use up all the resources, it would be the end of the planet. And so that became the basis for everything. So the argument was then, okay, we've got to reduce population. How do we do that? Well, do we want to reduce all the world's population? No, we only want to reduce the population of those nations that are using up the resources at a greater rate than all the other nations. So they then looked at the developing nations like the United States, and they said the United States is only 6% of the world's population, but it's using up 47% of the resources. We got to shut them down. So Maurice Strong, sadly a Canadian, in an interview with Elaine Dewar, and she said, well, you know, you want to shut down the industrialized nations of the world. How do you go about doing that? And why don't you run for politics? And he said, you can't do anything as a politician. I'm going to go to the UN where I can get all the money I want, not be accountable to anybody. The way they did it was, and think about this, if somebody said to you, I want to shut down the industrialized nations of the world, how would you do it? Because that's what's clever about these people, the genius of it. And the answer is, if you think of a nation, a developed nation like the US, it runs on fossil fuel. It's developed its economy and the whole thing's based on fossil fuels. Well, you can shut down a car engine, just like you can shut down a nation, by stopping the flow of fossil fuels. That will stop the engine. But if you do that, people get angry. It's political suicide. But if you could show that the byproduct of the engine, CO2, was causing runaway global warming, now you could say to people, hey, that's all very nice, that fossil fuels, but the byproduct is causing runaway global warming. It's causing climate change. You're destroying the planet. That's why the focus, CO2, became the focus, okay? And then to make sure that the scientists that were assigned to prove that, the IPCC, they gave them this very narrow definition that left out the real cause of the climate change or global warming, which is the sun. The sun is the major factor above all of it. And even worse, as you guys know, of the three gases that they say are greenhouse gases, that is, they allow sunlight in but slow down the rate of heat escape, water vapor is the most important, right? 95% by volume, by far the most important, but they don't even look at it. And do you know how they got around looking at it? They said, well, humans produce water vapor, but it's so small relative to the total amount in the atmosphere, we'll just ignore it. But I know the water vapor in the atmosphere varies more from day to day and year to year than all of the variations in CO2 could cause. But because they've got these terms of reference, they can ignore it. And they can ignore the sun. They can ignore, I don't know if you learned about Milankovitch cycles, for example, right?
Yeah.
They don't even include that in their computer models. And when you talk about the 800-year lag, what they do in their computer, the only place in the world where a temperature or where CO2 increase precedes a temperature increase is in their computer models. Every other record we have, the temperature goes up before the CO2, including the Vostok record. And so you create a computer model in which you say, okay, if CO2 increases, the temperature will increase. You then cause you increase the CO2 in the computer model, and the answer is, oh, the temperature went up. You then say, oh, that proves what I said at the start. It's what's called circular arguments, and it's very cleverly done. But that's a very long-winded answer to your question about why CO2 is the focus and how they ignored the sun, which is the really important factor.
So do you think that the very small amount in scale to the entire atmosphere, the small amount of CO2 and, as you said, water vapor, has any influence whatsoever on climate change?
The water vapor has an influence, no question about it. And you guys are in a relatively dry state there, you Colorado, right?
Yes.
You go further west into the deserts and Utah and so on. Well, what happens there? And you can get it, Phoenix, for example, you can get a daytime high of 110 degrees, but at night it can go down below freezing.
Yeah.
Why does that happen? And the answer is because there's no water vapor in the air. It's nothing to do with CO2. It's strictly water vapor. And the farmers in Colorado will tell you that in the fall, if you got clear skies, the heat escapes and you get frost. If there's cloud cover or the water vapor, the humidity is high, the heat doesn't escape and you don't get frost. So the water vapor is very important in terms of functioning as a greenhouse gas. CO2, nothing. I don't think CO2 is a greenhouse gas at all, but that's part of the scientific argument that's going on. And of course, you'll find a lot of people will give you different ranges of temperatures of what effect they think CO2 has. I happen to think it's zero, but that's another argument. But water vapor, absolutely. And by the way, I had taught a water resources class for 25 years, and I used to give out buttons to the students was change the name of the planet from Earth to water, because water is much more important. And you guys know in Colorado and the droughts and as you go further west and the Colorado Compact and on the Colorado River there and all the structures, water is a huge issue. And by the way, there's no shortage of water, but that's going to be the next big claim. Oh, we're running out of water and it's due to human abuse and so on. It'll replace the climate change issue in your generation as the big scare to control you, because that's really what it's all about.
Yeah,
we've already heard that.
Yeah, we've definitely started doing that in classes.
Yeah.
It's definitely starting to be a big topic. So you said that the sun is the major problem, or the major helps cause it.
Yes.
Is that like the Milankovitch cycles?
Yeah, there's actually there's three ways of the sun affects the temperature. One is the electromagnetic radiation, that is heat and light, and so obviously you can see the effect of that because in the morning the sun comes up and the temperature goes up, and at night the sun goes down and the temperature goes down. That's the sun doing that. Okay, so the heat and light from the sun is an important factor. The second factor is the Milankovitch effect. And by the way, we've known about parts of that, the Milankovitch effect, for almost 200 years. The idea that the orbit of the Earth around the sun is not, as I don't know if you're being taught this, well, obviously you're not if you know about Milankovitch, but up until about 20 years ago, all of the textbooks said the orbit of the Earth around the sun is a small elliptical orbit. Well, we've known for over 200 years that's not true. There was a Scottish scientist by the name of Kroll who was trying to determine how much the changing ellipticity of the orbit caused climate change. And he was doing that in 1759. So none of this is new. It's just that people don't know about the science and literature. And so, by the way, what causes that orbital change, orbital eccentricity as it's called, is the gravitational pull of the planet Jupiter. So that's what causes that distortion of the Milankovitch. The second thing with Milankovitch is the changing tilt of the Earth. You look into most books, they say, oh, the tilt's 23.5 degrees. It isn't. That's just close enough for government work. And not only that, but the tilt is constantly changing from 21.8 to 24.4. Now think about that in terms that I flew search and rescue in the Arctic for 5 years. So I watched this. I've seen the 24 hours of darkness in the winter months. But the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic Circle are lines that mark the point at which the sun's rays are tangential to the surface of the Earth. And they mark the point where in the winter it's 24 hours of darkness north of that line. But if you change the tilt of the Earth, then the latitude of the Arctic and Antarctic circles change. That's how important that is, okay? And then the third one is a bit more complicated. It's called the precession of the equinoxes. Now, this is important for you to understand, because underlying all of what you've been taught is that our view of the world, and by our view, I mean the Western view. I work with Chinese climatologists. The Chinese see the world completely differently than we do. And it amuses me when the governments are saying, oh, we're talking to the Chinese. No, you're not even the same universe, okay? So you have been educated in a scientific world that is called uniformitarianism. That is, that change is very gradual over long periods of time. That is not true. And of course, one of the things that shows that it's not true is that we have to keep changing our calendars. The calendars are fixed. Well, we create a calendar, but then the sun and the earth keep changing because of the Milankovitch effect. And every once in a while, we have to change the calendar. So in 1752, for example, and I'm looking at the fur trade records of the Hudson Bay Company, September the 2nd entry is in there. And then the next entry is September the 13th. So, oh, what happened? Well, the government ordered everybody to add 11 days to the calendar. And there was a funny story with this because they had riots in England. People thought the government were shortening their lives by 11 days. I was teaching at a penitentiary, a jail, and I was telling them about this. And I said everybody was upset. And one of the prisoners said, I know one group of people that weren't upset, right? Because their sentence was shortened by 11 days.
Oh. Yeah, okay.
So everything's relative, right? But anyway, it was because our calendar is fixed. Nature isn't. It's constantly changing, and it changes very rapidly. So if you think about, for example, that just 20,000 years ago, you have an ice sheet covering most of North America that's larger than the current Antarctic ice sheet. So that's the Milankovitch effect. The other way that the sun affects the global temperatures is we've known for a long time that as the number of sunspots vary, the global temperature varies. But we didn't know what the mechanism was. And one of the things you should learn in your science is that drawing correlations, just because something's correlated, doesn't mean to say it's a cause and effect. I mean, the one I used to tell my students was that Diet Coke causes obesity. You guys still on there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, the picture froze there for a minute. Anyway, I used to tell my students that Diet Coke causes obesity, and my proof was that that obese people drink more Diet Coke than anyone else. Therefore, it must be the Diet Coke that's causing the obesity. Well, that's illogical, but that's the danger in science, that just because things appear to be occurring together, you can't assume that they're working. And so we knew the sunspot numbers. As the sunspot numbers increased, the global temperature went up. As they decreased, the temperature went down. But we didn't have a mechanism. And then in 1991, some Swedish researchers discovered that the sunspots were simply evidence on the sun of change in the sun. And what was happening was the sun's magnetic field strength was changing. As it changed, it controlled the amount of cosmic radiation reaching the Earth, and that determined the amount of low cloud cover on the Earth. And of course, if you change the cloud cover, you're going to change the climate. And so it's just like putting up a screen in a greenhouse, the same idea. So now, again, the IPCC don't even talk about that in their reports. They don't even mention it in their models. So that's the long-winded answer to your question about the changes in the sun that have an influence on global climate that are not even looked at in the official record.
Yeah. So
I'm ruining your Friday evening.
You are not. This is actually very
okay.
So this is kind of going on to like a different kind of, not view, but like a different part of it, I guess. So you touched on this a little bit, but do you think that people in more like rural and like, I guess like, developing countries and like parts of the world, are they more or less affected by global warming than like people in like the United States or places that are already developed or developing, like, are they more affected or less affected, do you think, than we are?
I think it's not just the effect, but the ability to cope. And one of the things that you probably don't know, you all know about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, right? And the Oklahoma going west and all that. The drought that hit America, North America in 1988, 89 was worse than the 36 drought. But because they developed better technology, better economies, better ways of coping with it, hardly anybody knew in the public. And so the technological ability to cope with things has improved. But here's the ironic thing. Let's say that the whole world does go into total disaster tomorrow. The people that are at the subsistence level in the developing countries, they'll survive better than we will. And the example, I always tease my kids about this. I remember one time the power went off and I said, what are you going to do? They said, we're going to go in the basement and watch television till the power comes back on. And he'd say, hello, hello. and there's that disconnect, you see, between the dependency upon energy. And so in one sense, the technology allows us to cope better with changes. But when the disaster gets to a certain level, we will have a much harder time accommodating than people in that are already at the subsistence level. Because if you're just scraping out a living, you just continue scraping out a living. It's just another day as far as they're concerned. So it's not a simple answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
What would you say is, if you had one statement that you could say to the public change, because it's obvious that the public isn't as informed on this topic as we should be. So if there was one thing that you could say, what would that be?
Oh my goodness. I think the old story would ask questions, but what questions would you ask? And you really need to set up your question with a statement like, did you know that CO2 is only 4% of the greenhouse gases? And why as your questions were, why has CO2 become the focus? And then you could go on from that and say, look, you can define science as the ability to predict. If your predictions are wrong, your science is wrong. And everybody knows that weather forecasts beyond tomorrow are useless. And so it's like I used to do with farmers. I'd say, phone up the government and say, what's it going to be like a year from now? And they say, well, we don't do long-term forecasts. And then phone them the day after that and say, what's it going to be like 50 years from now? And they say, warmer. In other words, get the people thinking about the disconnect between what they know and what they're being told. And so, as I said, to narrow that down to a single question, I mean, you could be as cynical as to say, do you trust anything the government tells you? Right? Yeah. And of course, that by the way, and that's a huge difference between Canada and the United States. Canadians trust their government far more than Americans do. And of course, Canada was formed by people that when America was going through its Revolutionary War, they left the United States to set up Canada. They wanted to remain under a monarchy. And so we, of course, have that legacy, and that's a big difference between Canada and the United States. But yeah, to put it down to one question or one point, very, very difficult, but certainly the weather forecasting one. And by the way, one of the ways to answer your question is go and listen to people like George Carlin, if you can cut out the language, or some of the comedians who make fun about it. And one of their favorite stories is, they can't tell you the weather 2 days from now, but they're certain about 50 years from now. And the audience laugh. That's what resonates with people.
Yeah.
Okay. Am I passing?
Yeah. Yes. So what do you think about deforestation and that is affecting global warming? Because there's definitely a lot of scientists, the that deforestation is having a big impact on global warming?
Okay, there are many issues: deforestation, desertification, ocean acidification, and all of these scare tactics. I'm going to answer your question. It's a bit unfair in a way. I'll answer the forestation question specifically in a minute, but I want you to go and look up a book called "But Is It True?" All right, and this was written by a professor, Aaron Vidalski. He's passed away now. But he got graduate students at university who didn't have science degrees and said to them, okay, there's these issues of deforestation, of all of these things. I want you to go and search out, what is this based on? How true is this? How real is it? And he published their findings as the book called But Is It True? And every single issue that you can mention that we've talked about here turned out not to be true at all. Okay?
Yeah.
And when you start digging into statistics, I mean, one of the things I used to give my students in first year, I say, okay, I want you to go and find out what the world's population is. The two best authorities are the United States Census Bureau, who keep track of the world population, and the United Nations. Their total for the world population differs by 6 million people. That's more than the population of 120 countries in the world. So when they say, well, virtually all of the numbers that you hear are estimates, they're made up. And so take a look at that book, Yes, But Is It True? And that really would be my answer. Now, with deforestation, for example, this came about because of the environmentalists saying, oh, they're cutting all the rainforest. Well, why were they cutting the rainforest in Brazil and these other countries? Well, because the World Bank had said to Brazil, we'll lend you money to develop your economy, but you've got to increase your agricultural production. Okay, and in order to increase your agricultural production, you got to cut down the forest. So in other words, they started cutting the forest because they were being paid to do it. The minute people like me pointed out hey, you're encouraging the deforestation, they stopped the flow of money, they stopped cutting the rainforest. And then they went to say, well, how much rainforest has been cut? And the scientists said, we don't know. So they went to the accountants and said, well, how much rainforest? And they did it on the basis of their estimates of how much money would be needed to counter deforestation. It turned out their estimates were wrong by 80%. Yet that was the number everybody was using. So none of these numbers bear. And by the way, there is more forest in every continent of the world today than there was in 1980. Every single continent, including the United States. And you go and look up the statistics, for example, just New York State alone, there's over 1.5 million acres of forest more today than there was in 1770. Because what's happening is people we produce more food on smaller area, and of course, replanting the forest, replacing the forest, and so on. So in fact, the forests of the world are growing. And the forests of the world are also growing because the CO2 level is going up, and the more CO2 they get, the more trees grow. So as I said, that's a long-winded answer to your deforestation question, but it applies to every single one of the environmental alarmist things that you hear or read about.
Yeah. So
About it, I think.
yeah, those are like our main questions, I think. I had one that I was kind of just curious.
Yeah.
So how long have you been like interested, I guess you could say, in global warming? Like, when did you start your research on it?
Climatology.
Yeah.
Well, climatology, actually, as a young man, I was born in England, and I was born near Stonehenge. You know what Stonehenge is? The monument in England, built 2400. Okay, I was born near there. And so whenever it said on the government form, it said religion, I always put Druid. Okay, which of course just a joke. But I said, well, how, in order to build a big temple like that, you have to have surplus labor. And in order to have surplus labor, somebody's got to be producing enough food to feed 2 people. And one of the things that made the United States the greatest nation on earth, the most powerful nation on earth, is that for the first time in history, you were producing surplus food. And surplus food is surplus time, and then you create any kind of civilization that you wanted. That got me interested in early civilizations and how did the climate change so that they were able to start producing more food. Then I came to Canada and, of course, got interested in the weather and climate of Canada, which, as you know, is quite different than a lot of the rest of the world. But I was working in an office job, and I lost my job. And I went and joined the Canadian Air Force. And as I said, I ended up flying search and rescue in the Arctic. That really got my interest going in terms of climate, weather and climate and glaciology and so on. Because one of the things that you have to realize is Canada is 4,000 miles from coast to coast along the US border, but we're also 4,000 miles the other way. Right? And just to give you an idea, they talk about overpopulation. Humans only live on about 4% of the world's land surface. And yet you believe, oh, we're occupying every planet. One day we were on a search for a family out of California. He bought his wife an airplane for her birthday, and they had bought a sawmill up in northern Canada, a place called Fort Chipewyan. And they took off from Fort Chipewyan to fly back to Edmonton and then on back to California. The bush pilots wouldn't fly. The weather was so bad. The plane went missing. We were called out on a search. On the second day of the search, the brother of one of the guys that was missing came up in the cockpit, and I'm sitting in the right-hand seat. And he starts shouting at us, said, "You're flying around in circles. You're wasting our time. I'm going to report you to the government. I'm a friend of Governor Brown of California, and I can pull power and all that." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You're flying around in circles." And I said, "Well, here's the map. We cover 10,000 square miles this morning." And he said, "But I haven't seen a road, a village, nothing, no evidence of humans whatsoever." I said, "Welcome to Canada." Right? And we actually, to convince him, we flew back to the Slave River, down the Slave River to Fort Chipewyan, or along the Peace River back to Fort Chipewyan. And his only comment when he got off the airplane was, "I'll never complain about overpopulation again."
Yeah.
Okay? And so that idea about overpopulation and so on, and deforestation, it's so distorted. I've gone away from what your original question was, but how did I get interested in climate change? Well, all of those things got me interested. Then I lost my hearing. I lost my flying category because of hearing loss. And by the way, that's something worries me with young people with the, Apple control the volume in those headphones that you get. When I went to have my ears tested, they told me which airplanes I was flying by the frequencies that were missing in my audiogram. And but anyway, I couldn't fly anymore. I didn't want to fly a desk. I got a small cash settlement from the government for my military service, and I decided to go back to university. I did it the right way. I went when I was 30 years old. Nobody should be allowed to go to university right out of high school. You haven't got a clue who you are, what you want to do. And by the way, nobody ever tells you this, but the failure and dropout rate in university in America and Canada is around 48%.
Wow.
They never tell you those statistics. And if you're gonna go to university, go when you go for your reasons and you know what you want to do. Otherwise, don't even start. You're better to go to a technical college and get some whatever. But anyway, so I looked around and I thought, well, climate, history and climate, there's an interesting thing, nice, peaceful topic, no politics in that. So I started studying climate. And one of the things I discovered was we had no long-term records of how much the climate changes over time. So I lived in Winnipeg, which is in central Canada, and they had the records of the Hudson Bay Company. They kept daily journals, and they recorded the weather on a daily basis. They had thermometers and barometers at Churchill on Hudson Bay as early as 1768. And so when you look at that long-term record, you see how much the climate changes naturally all the time, which is why my earlier comment that the climate change we're experiencing now is perfectly natural, well within normal variability. And so that's what my doctoral thesis was about. And of course, then I got caught up in all of the use of climate, because what they wanted was a threat to the whole planet. You see, they couldn't come out with something that said, oh, this is only affecting America. They had to have something that was affecting the whole world, because they want one world government, and that's why they chose the climate issue. Anyway, that's another whole story. Does that give you an idea of where I'm from?
Yeah.
And by the way, travel. Please travel. Before you go to school or college, go travel. You will learn more about yourself and about your country and about the world in 1 month traveling in Europe or Asia than all of the university courses you could ever sit through.
Yeah, I know I definitely am planning on traveling, getting some stuff in before
Australia, right? Australia?
Yes. That
That
sounds okay.
well, you notice how many Australians come up to North America, of course, a lot of them.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Taking up so much of your time. I'm sorry. I hope you can edit this down and it fits in with your program well. I was going to say, if you have any questions, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, it's going to be hard for us to edit it down because we only have 6 minutes and there's so much good topics that you have covered. And trust me, it hasn't been a waste of our time. We appreciate everything you've done to make this work.
Thank you so much for doing this with us.
But by the way, a 6-minute presentation is much more difficult than a 60-minute presentation. Because you got to distill it down. And here's a quote that you can use when you start out. Say, look, we only have 6 minutes. And Samuel Johnson, who wrote the first English dictionary, he said that nothing focuses the mind like the thread of a hanging. Right? That when you're really cornered, you start to focus your mind very, very much. But as I said, if you have any questions or anything that doesn't make sense to you, just email me, or right away I'll get answers back to you as quickly as I can.
And thank you again for responding so quickly.
Yeah, thank you. It really gives us a lot of time.
You know, in my family, there's 5 children, and 4 of us are teachers. So, and I taught at the university level, and then I had my sister taught special needs children, and I had a brother taught high school, and another brother that taught elementary. So, and I always argue that proves it's genetic. The only thing I'm afraid of is it's a recessive gene.
Oh yeah, I hope not.
Yeah.
No. Okay. And by the way, I do a lot of counseling of students about careers. And some of the comments I've made to you about university and so on, and they're asking you at a time, as I said, when you're still trying to figure out who you are, what you want to do with your life. And one of the things you'll discover is every year that goes by, there's whole career things you never even knew existed that suddenly come up. The one thing that you must do is be selfish. You live in a Judeo-Christian society, which is saying, "Oh, what are the neighbors going to think?" Or what are you have to, because who's the one person you're going to spend your whole life with?
Yourself.
Yeah.
Right. And if you can't live with yourself, you're sure as heck can't live with anybody else. Right.
That's
and so rather than thinking about a specific job like chartered accountancy, think about who you are as a person. The things that you like to do. Like, do you want to sit in an office and look at numbers and books? No, well then don't go be a chartered accountant, right?
Yeah.
Think very simple things like, do you want to live in the city or live in the country? Do you want to work for yourself or work for government? Do you want to travel or stay in one place? I'll just give you one quick example to get some thinking going. I had a student who wanted to teach, but she particularly wanted to teach special needs children because she'd had a friend who was deaf as a child. But she also wanted to travel. So, of course, she goes to the school counseling and does all those stupid computer tests and so on. And of course, the counselor said, well, no, you can't, that's a terrible, you can't put those things together. Here's what I did. Got her registered in an education degree, okay? Then in special needs education. And then in her second year, in the evening, signed her up for a sign language course at the local community college, okay? Then in her third year, she went and took a course to be a travel agent. She is now an expert in travel for deaf children. That's the way that you mix and match and create careers that fit you and your personality. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I got a pickle for you.
Okay.
I love animals. I want to be a veterinarian.
Good.
But I also love U.S. history, and I love the Spanish language.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, Spanish is becoming the second language of America, and so there's going to be a big demand by Spanish-speaking people for veterinarian services. The bigger issue for you is whether you want to do small animals or big animals. Big animal veterinarian is really where the money is, but nobody wants to do it. And you watch that, I don't know if you watch that program, Dr. Pole.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And watch the two women veterinarians on there. Wonderful illustrations of, you know, the small animal veterinary and the large animal veterinary. And of course, then the other thing is that you can do in your spare time and make a name for yourself as a veterinarian by writing a book on the history of veterinary medicine.
There you go.
I like it.
And by the way, go and look at how important vets were in the Civil War because of all the horses they had and the care that they needed, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
how things changed. So yeah, no, that's not a pickle at all. I love pickles. Anyway,
would you at all be interested in, when we're done with the video, would you want me to email you a link so you can see how we put it all together, or is that?
Well, let me back up. I'm very interested in that, but I don't want to put you to extra work. Okay, and so if it doesn't take 2 minutes other than just to click the link and send the thing up, be good. Because one of the things I taught seniors classes, you know, people over 65, and by the way, a lot of them were women who grew up where they never got to go to university, and I used to. The students would say, "Can we use them as a group to do surveys for our research projects?" And so we had an agreement with the seniors. Yes, they would answer the questions for the students, but there were two conditions. One was that there were no questions about sex. Okay, that was the first condition. The second condition was that the student had to come back and report the results of their study. So it was an interesting thing. So from that point of view, yeah. But as I said, I don't want to put you to extra work.
Oh, it's absolutely no extra work. It might be a couple of weeks before we have the whole video finished, but it's definitely no extra work. We'd love to have your input on how it finally turned out. Okay.
One of the things, of course, one of the things you'll learn, by the way, is how editing in a movie is so important.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the editor, and they always say what gets left on the editing floor, what part of the movie, and so picking out and that really is a challenge, and keep it as simple as you can. It's like if you're traveling. My mother always said, if you're going traveling, lay out on the bed what you want to take and then pack half of it.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I'm full of wisdoms here. Thank you for taking Sorry, go ahead.
I said I've already got an idea for the end of our video. We're going to have a short segment. It's going to be called Dr. Tim Ball gives life advice, and we're going to talk about your school advice, your travel advice,
Right.
being selfish,
Yes.
and only pack half of what you want to take.
Exactly. No, that's great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for taking your evening and your time, and good luck with your project. And I don't. Yeah. Okay. I've talked too much. We could talk all night. Thank you. As I said, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to call me.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.